All right. Well, thanks so much, folks, for coming today. My name is Emily Sherrio. For those of you who don't know me, I'm one of the volunteer admins here at Locally Optimistic. We have a really incredible panel today of Sean Taylor, Michelle Ballen, and John Lee. We're going to talk to us about getting started with experimentation. If you're in a place where you can turn on your camera, please do. It's a little bit easier than feeling like you're talking to a wall of people. And even if you have to sit on mute, that's totally fine. We're going to be using the Slack channel. Again, that's Meetup. Meetup Getting Started Experimentation instead of the Zoom chat today. If you have any questions, please do pump them in there and we will ask people to come off mute to talk through them. With that, I'm going to throw it over to our speakers to introduce themselves. Michelle, I see you on my screen first. So do you want to name where you work, your familiarity with experimentation, and then we'll do Sean and then John.
Sure. Yeah. So hi, everyone. I see some familiar faces here. It's great to see everyone. I'm Michelle. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, and I just recently started a new role working in analytics at a company called Future. We're in the fitness technology space. And my experience with experimentation really stemmed from the fact that I started my career in analytics as a digital product analyst. So doing a lot of work on like optimizing conversion funnels and working on evaluating the efficiency of different like feature releases and things like that. And then kind of over time, broadened my scope outside of digital products and then kind of took with me that technique and applied it to other areas. It's great to be here.
Thanks, Michelle. Sean?
Hey, everybody, I'm Sean. I guess my experience with experiments starts in my academic career, where I was really excited about running experiments a long time ago as a social scientist. And then I worked at Facebook for 7 years and kind of gravitated toward non-standard, weird types of testing issues, like can we run experiments in unusual ways and unusual settings? And there were lots of challenges like that at Facebook. And then I spent the last 3 years at Lyft working on marketplace experimentation, which has its own unique flavor to it. And trying to kind of move the ball forward and build some new tech there. And now I'm unemployed and just sort of thinking about what's next.
Funemployed is the way the kids call it these days. John, tell us about you.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. I'm John. I'm a director of data science at Cameo. Before this, I held product analytics roles at Thumbtack, which is a local services marketplace, and NerdWallet, a personal finance recommendation app. And before that, I started my career at Capital One. I've worked on experimentation in all of these companies, primarily as an analyst. But yeah, excited to be here and hopefully share some knowledge with everyone.
Thanks, you three, for those intros. The audience today kind of sets a wide variety of experiences where some people will have some idea of what experimentation looks like, and some people think experimentation is cool, but they've never seen it in practice. So, Michelle, maybe start us off with a little bit about like, what is an experiment and what does it mean to be working at a company that is using experimentation from a data perspective?
Yeah, so I like to think of experimentation as like a set of technique or processes for isolating a variable. So if a company is kind of trying to debate, what feature should be released or what marketing channel should we be investing more dollars in, like how can you isolate that variable and kind of have two different groups where you can compare the two and really confidently say what you think the impact or the influence of that variable is. And so in organizations that do it well, like they feel confident and they have a really good understanding over time of like what influences and what will move the business. And so also like selfishly, I personally will push for experimentation so much because if I get the question of like, hey, we just launched this thing, can you tell me how it did? It's so hard. We see in the numbers, like there's so much variability every day, like, the economy could influence how your business is performing, right? And so not being able to isolate those variables when you're doing kind of like a pre-post analysis makes it really challenging for analysts. You spend so much time trying to like weed through the data and find that smoking gun. And ultimately, like the cleanest, easiest way to answer the question, what was the impact of this, is to run that holdout group and isolate that variable. So it's something that I, like I said, selfishly push for a lot. And I find that it makes our team like super, efficient, not having to waste time doing these post hoc analyses and diagnostics of what happened. And it also just helps us over time build up the knowledge base of like, if you run a few experiments, you have those under your belt and the learnings from them. When you have that next question, what do we think this is going to do? You can kind of pull on that experience. Like, oh, well, last time we did this, we saw influence conversion behavior in this way. And so we might see a similar trend here. Does that, now we can kind of like be a little bit more informed of, is that something that we should invest in, or should we kind of explore another route? If that makes sense.
It does. It does. We ran experiments at my last role at Netlify, and what I found is that there are a number of prerequisites to experimentation, and some of them are technical and some of them are cultural. So, John, do you want to talk a little bit about some of these prerequisites to experimentation? Maybe let's start with the technical piece. What does your experimentation infrastructure need to look like?
Yeah. So I would first start with the raw data. You need to have your product instrumented, which is a fancy way of saying you need to be able to measure what actions are people taking in your product, and specifically what actions that are of interest to you. It's possible to run experiments where you haven't instrumented the product as much as you would like, but you have some kind of event data that's being collected, whether in a tool like Amplitude or Mixpanel or in an in-house event system. But you're able to get all this data and basically count, okay, for every person, like what actions have they taken? Because then you can actually then run an experiment where you randomize people into a treatment group or a control group, and you can say, well, how is the difference in the rate of actions being taken in these groups? How does that look like? And so that matters because that's how you learn about how people are using your product. And this can sound easy, but I think any analyst or data scientist can tell you that event data is one of the most annoying things to work with many times, especially because there's some people you have to work with to get things working as you would like. And then you also need some kind of software to randomize assignment to the experiment, which is a whole other thing. Luckily, there's off-the-shelf tools these days where you can buy that can help you do that. And then so once you have your you have the ability to run an experiment in your product. I'm assuming it's a digital product. You have a website and hopefully a mobile app. But you can randomize people between, you can measure what they're doing, and then you actually have the data to plan an experiment, and then you get into like the technical aspect of designing an experiment, like figuring out what's my randomization unit. Like, do I want to assign like anonymous people like cookies? Do I want to assign logged in users? Do you want to assign something more complicated like a market-based experiment where you're assigning people based on geography or some other category? Lots of things to design there. Figure out your sample size, how long your experiment needs to run, how many people you need. And so that's where analysts or data scientists come in and help with like doing those computations. Like I think we all have the tools these days to be able to do that, even a spreadsheet. And then you can run your experiment technically. You can analyze it using, again, your spreadsheet or hopefully something better like a notebook in Jupyter, Python or R. And then you get data, you get results, and then you get into the cultural stuff, which is a whole other thing. So maybe I'll pause there. Let's see if the technical stuff made sense.
I tried to log what you were saying in the chat as we were going. Folks, if you have questions for John about any pieces of this technical infrastructure, please don't hesitate to throw it in there. I am going to want to come back to some of the planning and experiment design pieces later on. But before we do that, let's jump into the cultural piece a little bit. Sean, tell us about some of the cultural parts of experimentation that you've seen as prerequisites. Let's not even get to the it's going wrong piece yet.
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, as you were asking me to like introduce myself, I was thinking, what was my most lasting contribution to Facebook? And I created a group there internally called Experimentalists, and it just became this like 500-person community of people chatting and discussing like broadly about experimentation rather than about specific business stuff, and just kind of like cultivating an interest in it as a methodology and using it as a tool to answer questions. And I think that's a really important part of it, is that people have to find it to be like interesting and important. But then like there's a sort of like more important piece, which is that all your product and engineering side of things believe that experiments are the way that they evaluate progress and success. So you sit in a meeting and someone says, hey, we're going to do this project. One of my first questions is, how are we going to know that it worked? And if your culture is good, then the answer is, well, we have this test in mind at the end, and then the test will tell us whether it worked or not. And if your organization defaults to experimentation as a tool for evaluating project success and whether you're making progress toward a goal, then I think you have a good, healthy experimentation culture. And often that's the big fight. It's just like whether we should even be running experiments in the first place.
So if I think that changing our button from blue to black is going to make it easier for everyone to find, why would I only roll that out to some portion of the population? Like, I'm convinced this is the solution. Why don't I just make this change for everyone, Sean?
I actually think that you should just, if you think that it's a design thing like that, what experiments you should run. Experiments are a costly resource, right? You should run every test that you can. And then if it's a button color change, then I think running an experiment is a little overkill for that. So I'm very much like kind of in the middle ground here. Like, not everything should be an experiment. Let's be decisive about, our strategy and particularly like, design sensibility. But I do think that experiments are a pretty powerful tool for detecting when things go wrong that you didn't expect. So, maybe you do launch that button change to 99% of people, and you can keep 1% in a holdout group. And maybe you learn that something really bad happened in addition to the change that you intended, and it can be very valuable to do that. So, I'm arguing both sides here, but it's good to have experiments as a way of detecting regressions in addition to just knowing if something is slightly better than what the old thing was.
I love that. So I'll open this up to the panel. Whoever wants to can jump in. There are technical hurdles. There are cultural hurdles. How do you go about bringing in the cultural and technical pieces? At what point is your company like at the right level of maturity for that? Or are there other things to consider? Do you need a certain level of data maturity? Is it a data volume? What are the considerations there?
You definitely need enough data to run experiments. So like if you're an early like data or stealth company and you only have 50 users, like at that point, you're not going to be able to get statistically sound results from an experiment anyway. So you should probably focus more on like talking to users individually or doing some sort of user testing to kind of glean insights about how you should be moving the product forward. The sample size is a big input for how long an experiment does take to be able to draw conclusive results and make decisions. So that's definitely a big factor.
How do you know if you have enough data? So John brought up experiment design earlier. How do people know if they have enough data, how long an experiment's going to take to run, things like that?
Yeah, so there are like really nifty tools on the internet. I'm sure people here have seen them, but like experimentcalculator.com is an example of one. And basically it's really a conversation with the working team of like, okay, we're gonna make this change. What is the effect that we want to be able to detect with confidence? Is it that we're increasing conversion by like 20% or more? And if it's not 20% or more, then like we just don't care, right? So what is that baseline minimum detectable effect? That's a big input for how long you need to run an experiment for. And that kind of, you can back into the math of like, okay, is it worth running an experiment? Another thing is your significance level. How confident do you want to be in these results? And then also how many variants do you want to run? And so based on those three things, you can kind of play around with them to lower your sample size, but it will also, it kind of depends on your risk aversion. Like, are you okay with running this experiment and not knowing whether it's a 5 or 10% difference, but you know confidently that it's not, that it is or is not 20% plus, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's certainly a big factor. And it's always a conversation of like, what do we want to know after this? What at the point that we launch this feature, how do we want to move forward? Like, what information do we want to have in our back pocket in order to make changes in the business, or how, are we comfortable not knowing? Are we comfortable rolling this out? And then if we see that our conversion rate overall is down 10%, being able to say, like, we don't know, it might have been that feature that we launched. It could also just be other influences.
I actually wanted to ask the other panelists about this, because I've only worked at big companies that are the sample sizes are large enough that we don't usually need to worry about whether the test is going to succeed on those terms or not. And we're also mostly proposing incremental changes. Like most of the effect sizes that I have seen in practice at Facebook and Lyft are like 0.5%, 1%. Like a 2% win would be like,
so lucky.
You go home for the year at that point. I don't know what it looks like in the earlier phases of a company where maybe you're willing to take bigger bets that are in the name of generating like a 10% or 50% change in something, or maybe like you have no idea if you have product market fit yet and you're trying like 100 things every week. Like what's that like at a in a smaller place where the experimentation has to be more rapid, I'm guessing, because you're not looking for small things, you're looking for big ones.
I would say it's about having that conversation up front, understanding with finance, like what is the effect we need to be able to see for it to make sense for us economically, right? And so then that's the number, that's the amount of time you're going to run the test for. And then and then you make a decision too of like, okay, if it's not significant, but maybe at the end we're seeing directionally 10% increase, but we know it's not statistically significant. What's the decision? Kind of coming up with all of these scenarios in advance of like, how are we going to approach this situation? I think that's a big learning just in general too for me, is like having those conversations up front of what are we going to do differently based on all these different scenarios. Because I find that when experiments win, people are like, oh, great, launch it. And if they don't, then they're really scrutinizing the design and then really questioning, oh, but is our instrumentation correct? And it's like, have those conversations up front and make sure that you feel good about the implementation, so that you don't find yourself in that situation of like not trusting the outcome.
Michael asks a question very similarly. Michael, do you want to come off mute and verbalize your question?
Yeah, for sure. So I think like one thing that's like beyond like the technical implementation of a test is like, why you're running the test, what you're looking to learn, and then what you're looking to do after the fact. I worked at like small companies to large companies, and I find that like bias is like the hardest thing to lasso and get control of, where like you run a test just to prove your concept so you can go do something that you want to do anyway, right? So like curious like people's approaches to solving that, where you're curbing other people's bias and other people's like lack of rigor of running a true test, so you can produce like a result that benefits not just yourself personally, right, and your value in your own work, but to the business, right, of what results we're looking to get from this.
There's a really, one of my favorite tools out there for what you're describing is an experimentation review meeting, which like every good kind of team that I've been on that has a good process has either a weekly or biweekly meeting where they review what experiments are we going to be doing and what's the results of the experiments that we did. And then, using that as a tool to have a discussion about, what should be done. And usually if you're planning an experiment, you're kind of committing to, here are my hypotheses and here's what I'll do depending on, what I happen to estimate at the end of it. But making that like a social process where people are involved and there's a discussion means that, there's no real one person having control over that decision. I've seen like people try to implement this like in the software itself, like, okay, when you set up the experiment, write down what you're going to do under certain conditions. And I just don't think that works. I think it's not binding enough. I think you really need like a culture and a community approach to it. And it requires putting people in the room to discuss the results, and it costs something in terms of time, but those people are also learning a lot by being in the room and learning about what's working and what's not. So you could think of it as like a bonus feature, is that everyone's finding out about what everybody's doing. And also maybe you learn, maybe some of the experiments might conflict with one another, and they learn, hey, what historically has worked and not worked from being in those meetings.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really important point. Like both Sean and Michelle have called out that you need to be thinking about, before you even think of running an experiment, like what's important to you. What are your objectives as an organization? what's the hypothesis you want to test, and then figure out, do I have enough data to even measure that before it's worth even figuring out, should we run an experiment? Because maybe it doesn't practically matter to you. Maybe the practical significance isn't there. But the other thing is pre-committing to, okay, so if we observe the data being this way, we'll do this, or that way, we'll do that. Knowing that in advance and socializing it, I think, is the key point, as Sean said, because it's kind of like we're social beings. Like, we will hold ourselves accountable if we think about this in advance and walk others through our thinking. And the ability to do that with other people also helps you pressure test that and makes everybody in the organization better. And doing that, I think, really develops the culture of experimentation that we were talking about earlier.
So we've been talking really theoretically so far, which is great. I think it's a good starting point. Maybe at this point, people want to roll up their sleeves and share some war stories, or maybe an experiment you ran that went really, really well or really, really wrong. Anything you can or want to share there. Don't all jump in at once.
I don't know if this is a war story, but I think it's like I don't know, I think fondly back on this experience. So I've worked personally with a few different subscription consumer businesses. And one, like, I guess, open question in all these organizations is like, should we have an email marketing program? And like, should we be emailing our users versus like, is there a risk of like waking the sleeping bear, right? So if we email someone, they'll remember they have a subscription and they can't, like, that's a terrible way to think about businesses in general, but it is something that I've heard a few times, right? Like, I'm going to email my user. They're then going to be reminded that they are subscribed to our product. They're going to go cancel, and now we're going to lose money, right? And so whenever you send an email, you will see that behavior of people canceling because it is acting as a reminder. But the thing about that is the email is not what caused someone to cancel. They weren't like, oh, I actually really like this product. Then you emailed me this thing and now I don't like your brand anymore, so I'm going to cancel. Most likely they did want to cancel it. It was a reminder. But actually, if you hadn't sent that email, they were going to cancel anyway. Or you just really pulled forward the cancellations. So I think doing those types of experiments to show that, okay, yes, we send this email and these users are going to have a higher churn rate. But actually, if you give the other group 30 days, you'll see that they equal out and they balance out, and that really it just pulled forward. And then think about all the revenue gains you got from sending that email, promoting this alternative like add-on product. Like, that is something that now the organization knows, hey, whenever we send an email, we're going to see an increase in churn, but we're really just pulling forward people who are going to cancel anyway. So I think that was like a good use of an experiment that just to like help everyone feel a little bit more at ease and focus on just like building a great building a great email marketing program, as opposed to like being so concerned that you're causing people to churn and making the sleeping bear. So done a ton of those, and like pretty much every email that I have like been a part of, we run it as an experiment. We have that whole group, and then kind of based on that decide how to move forward.
I am sorry, John, you go ahead.
Oh, let's see. Two things came to mind. One, I think it's from quite some time ago, but I had once, like, since Michelle brought up email experiments, I was once part of a team that we were running some experiments where we were doing like a global holdout on our marketing emails to kind of measure, what's the effect of, getting any of our marketing communications versus not getting any of them at all. And when we looked at the data, we weren't able to find any measurable, statistically significant effect of our marketing emails, which is very hard to square with the observations we had made when we were running campaign level experiments and observed statistically significant effects. And we realized, oh, there's this issue where, okay, we weren't actually properly assigning some people to this holdout group. And also this holdout group is actually very small. And so, if you have like a 1% global holdout and you're a startup, okay, actually this like the design actually maybe has issues from the start if the total effect size on your entire like portfolio of users is tiny. And the sad thing about this kind of story is going back to Sean's question earlier about what's it like being in a startup where you don't have as much data. Sometimes it's just like, well, that was frustrating. We like ran this experiment for a long period of time, and we actually can do nothing with this information because we don't trust the results here. And maybe there's no practical significance, or maybe there's no statistical significance because we didn't power this correctly at the start. And so this is unfortunately, I think, the reality of experimentation that isn't fun to talk about, but it's like one of those like war stories that like it's easier to suppress than talk about because it's not a fun outcome. So that's like one thing that came to mind.
Yeah, that really resonates. When I used to teach experimentation at Facebook for a long time to like the new cohorts of data scientists, and I would tell them the only way to fail in an experiment is to not learn anything at the end of it. But a lot of experiments end in that conclusion. you didn't learn if it worked or it didn't, and it's very unsatisfying. So yeah, my sort of story was that I was working on the comment ranking stack at Facebook where we were changing the way that we ranked comments under news articles, and that was sort of like a product surface that we wanted to kind of improve. And I set up a goal of a process goal of running 5 experiments a week on that. So the goal was not to like generate some amount of improvement, but I wanted us to get into a fast cadence of running many experiments. So when we had many hypotheses to test, so we tried lots of things. And after about a quarter of doing that, none of the tests had really moved any of the metrics that we cared about at all. And it just felt like we wasted a whole quarter running all these garbage tests. And at the end of that, I think what I learned is that choosing the right metric was really important. We were trying to improve metrics that were just too hard to move with the surface that we had, and trying to kind of like work on a powerful test. This sort of back to Emily's like black versus blue button thing. It's like testing things that aren't likely to generate large effects, or looking for like effect of the blue button versus black button on revenue or something like that is a waste of time. And you can spend all this time trying to do stuff like that, and then at the end you just ran a bunch of tests that wasted everybody's time. So I think that like really thinking hard about what are you doing? Is it going to be a large enough change to make a difference, and not wasting time on tests that don't generate changes is a really important piece of it. And looking, how you choose your metrics and how you choose what tests to run is a really big important part of that. That's like totally independent of the experiment as methodology question. Like what have you chosen to test is like decided before you get into the experiment, and what have you chosen to measure is decided before the experiment. And both of those things are determine your success much more than the methodological aspects.
I was in a meeting once with a product manager, and one of our metrics had a spike right around a launch. And so we had launched this new feature, let's call it apple picking, and he had noticed that like our user retention was way up since we had launched apple picking. And he wanted to make a bunch of statements like apple picking led to increased user retention. How should you address a product manager making those sorts of statements? You don't have to call them out in a big group meeting.
So playing back this scenario, you have like, you presented some data to a non-technical stakeholder. The stakeholder has stated an inference or conclusion they've drawn from that, which you don't think you agree with or have some reservations about. And are you getting at like kind of like culturally, like socially, how to handle the situation? Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's that piece. There's also the explaining causal effect, or another way we see this a lot is explaining statistical significance or p-values, things like that. How do you introduce these concepts to some of your non-technical or non-data stakeholders?
I have a pretty like maybe weird perspective about this, which is like it's important to decide what you want to be right about, right? And like if a product manager wants to claim a win for something that maybe wasn't a real win, but maybe it was, like I often don't fight about that because I just feel like it's not consequential. Sorry, there's a motorcycle. It's like it's just like you're wasting time fighting a battle that at the end of it, like whether you ship it or not, might not make a big difference to the organization. So maybe you can spend your time on more important questions like, was this a good test to run? Is this the right metric that we're measuring? But trying to battle everybody at all times and prevent every statistical mistake throughout your organization is a recipe for burnout and feeling like you're not effective. So really prioritizing like what decisions do you really want to improve? What are the important ones to make correctly, and what are the ones where you have the most risk of being wrong is really important, I think. And it's an underrated part of the process as well. It's like really, prioritizing what battles you're gonna fight and which ones you're not. But teaching in statistics education, I have a kind of another small group of people that I chat with about experimentation on a regular basis. And almost always the theme is that educating people in the organization and teaching them to think more rigorously about things is a big part of the job. It's just kind of like you just are always doing it. Maybe like 20 to 50% of your time will be spent on those tasks at all times.
Yeah, and to add to that too, providing that education in the context of the business that you're working on, like maybe looking back historically and showing, okay, what is the variance that we see in that metric? Okay, how does that metric differ based on different attributes about the data sets? Maybe it's like conversion rate by traffic source, kind of showing if we were to cut Facebook spend, like we will see that our conversion rate increases because all of our Facebook traffic generates like proportionally lower conversion rates and it pulls down our overall average. And so kind of just like making sure that they feel like rigorous about their understanding of the current metrics and how easily they can be manipulated. And maybe even showing like, if we were to do an A/B test analysis today, say we changed something yesterday or try to do a pre-post analysis, we didn't change anything, but let's just say we did and we've looked at the data, what difference would we see? Right? Like probably you would see a difference, but you didn't actually change anything. And that's just due to pure normal noise.
Yeah. One thing I'll quickly add is something I found pretty early on as a way to explain the statistical significance in practical terms was to talk someone through like, okay, sure, this may seem statistically significant, but it's a difference of 10 conversions versus 20 conversions. So that's actually not that meaningful in a practical sense. Trying to ground it in something that someone non-technical can wrap their mind around, I think is a usual good rule of thumb, but trying to explain these things rather than trying to explain the textbook stats and math behind it, trying to get quickly at what do you actually care about? Well, here's like a metric that captures that, and here's why intuitively you can't do this reasoning. But to Sean's point, picking your battles and when you want to do that, and sometimes it may not matter, but sometimes you actually need to stand your ground if it's looking like it's going to lead the team down a certain decision path that you maybe don't think is right. But other times you may say, yeah, like, I'm not sure if the data could support that, but actually, I think it's fine if we conclude that for now. We can always revisit this and run another experiment on that thing you're saying. And so there's various different ways to approach it.
I love to run another experiment. That's often my answer to, oh, we don't know the answer. Let's just run it again or run a longer one. Or, like, people underrate that as like a tool, but you don't have to get it right. That's the great part about experiments. It's like you can run another one next week, and then you just wait a little bit and you'll get a better answer to the question, which is like a super powerful tool to have. There's not a lot of questions in the world where you can just do better by waiting and being lazy, but that's one of them for sure.
Though I'll probably caveat that, Sean, with that's assuming you can run another one, assuming you have the data volume to allow for that. If you've worked at places I've worked, and probably some of what Michelle's experienced, where you're already like 4 months to run an experiment, waiting to run another one can lead to a little bit of a painful experience there.
Well, you just have to grow your user base to over 1 billion users, and then
Duh.
all these problems go away.
On Facebook.
Duh, I forgot about that solution. All right, a couple of other things I was hoping we could jump in here. There's some questions coming into the chat too, or coming into the Slack channel. We hear a lot about peaking in experiments. In a short, maybe couple of sentences, talk to us about like, what is the controversy around peaking? When should you look at your experiment results? When can you end an experiment early? TLDR versions here. I know there are whole stats classes dedicated to these sorts of questions, but. Michelle. Well, Sean, do you want to take a first stab and then maybe we can pull in Sven?
I have like a super controversial perspective about this, so I want to just caveat that like there's a standard advice here, which is to like be very careful about peaking, because peaking is a way to be wrong. Basically, you can be wrong because you look at an experiment too early and you see a positive result and it's the result of noise, and then you'll decide to ship something that wasn't really actually that good. And if you had waited longer, and gotten the right answer, then maybe you would have not decided to ship that thing. So it's just a way to make a mistake. Personally, I don't mind peeking at experiments because I think that often if there's something has gone horribly wrong, then you want to look early and look, and the strong results that you see early in the experiment are likely to be real. So it's a good way to like de-risk your experiment is to look at it. And I think taking that off the table is kind of crazy, actually. So that's number one. And number two, the kinds of mistakes that you tend to make when you peak are often the kind where it's like, it's okay to be wrong about that stuff. I have a bias for kind of fast decision-making in experiments. Like, I don't think you need to get every decision right. And trying to squash all sources of error from your process is a recipe for wasting a lot of time. And so like, I think, peaking does generate errors. I think the errors that it generates are not likely to be super large in practice. And usually you see when something works, it works like so clearly and so obviously that it right away. And when things don't work and they're sort of on the borderline, then it doesn't really matter. You could flip a coin and make a decision and you get the same outcome anyway. So, but that's, I want to just caveat that with like, probably you should learn why peaking is dangerous before you do what I tell you to do.
Yeah, there's a difference between peaking and drawing a conclusion. Like you can peak, you can monitor for sure, making sure nothing actually broke. You can kind of do like sequential testing where you're testing different thresholds over time and like checking in on different thresholds. And then maybe you can make a decision early, but certainly the best practice, especially if you're just starting out, is to kind of define that sample size, define that minimum detectable effect up front and wait the proper amount of time. But it's certainly like, if it's someone responsible peaking, then I think it's fine. It's just somebody who might get excited by a result and misinterpret it when in actuality, it was just due to random chance. And then making a decision to end an experiment and implement the feature, like that's a problem. But personally, I kind of like to see like what is a general trend for each of my experiments, and then you kind of can. Sometimes you can see like clear winners very early, not actually make a conclusion, but it's kind of fun to watch.
So I'm going to restate this, correct me if I'm interpreting things wrong, but maybe peaking isn't terrible. Just don't draw conclusions and stick to the calculations around how long your experiment should run that you calculated beforehand. If you're going to stray from this advice, make sure that that decision is statistically sound and you can justify it with some real numbers. John, I see you added a couple comments in the Slack. You want to talk through those?
Yeah, I was pre-registering that I suspected I would agree with Sean, and I did. I think actually the three of us seem unanimous in that we all think peaking is fine. If we define peaking as, let's just check on the data we're collecting and make sure that things are looking kind of as we expect. Because if the data is going to zero, then we should probably either like instrument something wrong with the product, something's gone wrong with data collection, or the product's broken, or the data is unrealistic, like unrealistically good. Either way, we should probably be peaking so we don't waste our time, like run the experiment for like months and then realize after the fact actually something was borked at the beginning. So I think peaking in that respect is fine. Peaking in the sense of, let's draw a premature conclusion from 2 days worth of data. That's less fine. And maybe 2 days is fine. If you work at a billion user company, maybe 2 days is a perfectly reasonable period of time to run an experiment. But you don't want to be drawing premature conclusions, making premature decisions before you've gotten enough data that you're confident in the decision you're making. But you should be looking at the data, I think, to make sure you're collecting the data right, that the product is working as you intended it to be working.
I see Sven here, so I'll kind of troll him a little bit, but for peaking, a statistician wants to sell you a tool for peaking, which is like some false discovery rate procedure, or some statistical procedure that will correct for you looking at the data early. And that's that the statisticians are like, they're selling you a certain product. I think that the product that solves peaking is the experiment review meeting, where you meet with people and you say, hey, you looked at this result too early and it's not done yet, so we're not shipping this. And that's like an alternative that's a lot less technically interesting, but is going to help your organization in a more important way than like trying to fix it with statistics. So never think of if you think of things as only math and statistics problems, you have a certain set of tools available to you. But if you think of them as they're social problems and we need to discuss why we made this decision too early, and then the solution is it's an organizational problem that you're solving, and that's through having a good culture and process.
It always comes back to the culture and process. Before we move on to Michael and Will's questions, Sven, you've come up a couple times. Do you want to add any comments here?
I mean, I think you can have both, right? You can have a good culture, and I think the experiment review meetings make a lot of sense. But I feel like also modern statistics allows you to kind of have your cake and eat it too, right? You have methods that allow for peaking that you can monitor safely, and I think that's there's a lot of benefit, especially for people who don't really get the nuance, right? It's already nuanced to think about hypothesis testing, so. I think there can be value depending on kind of your problem setting to use tools that kind of avoid the peaking problem. But I totally agree that culture is not just statistical techniques.
Michael, you've got a question in the chat. Do you want to come off mute and ask the panel?
Yeah, so my question's on like the use of like anchor metrics to like ground like a test results and like what you want to do next. Kind of what I mean by that is like using the black and blue button, right? Like you can run this test and find positive results with the blue button, just like shockingly better. But it may not be a good decision for the business from like peripheral metrics of like revenue, retention, things like that people are just like, no way. we cannot touch those, even if you're seeing gains in whatever small feature or product you're working on. So curious, like if that's like a widely adopted practice you guys do, issues you see in it, pros you see in it.
I mean, I think all organizations who run experiments a lot, the discussions often eventually gravitate toward trade-offs that you're making, because there's at some point you just run out of like everything you do is just strictly better than the old thing. At some point you're saying like, oh, this thing gets better, but this thing might get a little bit worse. And it's pretty natural to have guardrails on like, top line company metrics that are important can't be damaged by things that other teams are doing, and that's a very healthy attitude to say like we would often call those non-inferiority tests at Lyft. Like we want this thing to be equivalent in all ways on these metrics, but maybe generate an improvement on some operational efficiency or CPU cost or something like that. I think it goes back to defining what's your shipping criterion in advance. Like what if you make a rule? It's like, here, I'm going to get these estimates at the end, and I have a rule that's going to determine whether this is, something that we're willing to run in production. Then that rule would contain logic like that, like, whether these are so important to the business that we cannot damage them no matter what is really important. And that's where I think the fine-grained statistical testing stuff does get really important, is that like whether you harmed revenue or not, when you have a really weak test that that generated a very noisy effect on revenue. Noisily measured effect on revenue is true or not is really, really challenging. And I think that's where trade-offs plus uncertainty is a really, really tough challenge. And I haven't really seen the great approaches to that yet. But that's the hardest part, is when you have like a kind of marginally stat sig problem with an important metric, and then something good happens in another metric that you're well powered to detect. Those are the hardest situations in general.
Yeah, and I actually always recommend, especially early on, like picking that metric that your business actually cares about. So like in the case of the blue versus black button, like not just determining a winner based on click-through rate, but the ultimate conversion goal that you have. One like example story related to this is in one of the many like subscription consumer businesses that I have worked with. They changed their add to cart button, where it had previously said their like cost for a full order. It said the cost per day, they like divided by 30 days or something. And so it really dramatically increased add to cart rate, very quickly, obvious, spike that we saw. But ultimately conversion rate was flat or actually down. And so like if they had just decided, oh, we're going to use add to cart rate as our primary metric to determine a winner, like they wouldn't have actually seen improvement. And actually, if you think about it, that was a bad experience for consumers, right? Like they were adding something to the cart thinking that it was one price, maybe not totally clear on what it was, right? That drop off in cart abandonment rate increase, in which implies that the user or consumer was more confused, and that's not ideal. So unless you have like a very clear correlation upstream metric that you know whenever this increases, it always leads to a positive increase in my downstream metric that I really care about, I suggest starting with that like ultimate conversion goal as your primary metric.
Will, you've got the next question. Do you want to come off mute and maybe bundle both questions together just where we are on time?
Yeah. Yeah, so I've done a little bit of like web CRO testing and ABN testing. And I'm just wondering with data and data products, if it differs from those. And, you know, we were definitely doing it at the, you know, CTA color level and especially the text, the verbiage used. So I'm just wondering, like, if not that, like, what is the lowest level of granularity that you will experiment with?
I mean, it really does matter, I think, contextually, what you're the scale of your organization. Because for an organization like Google with billions of users, that kind of experiment actually is probably valid to run. Maybe not testing 50 shades of blue, I don't know, but testing things like that. You could actually have sample size, and it practically matters. Like a 0.1% difference in revenue could be millions or hundreds of millions of dollars for an organization like Google. If you're a smaller organization, it's different. And so I think a lot of it comes back to like practical significance. What does your organization need to be focused on in order to achieve its goals? And your hypotheses and the ones that you prioritize to experiment on should be the ones that you judge are likeliest to help you reach those goals. And that's going to depend on the organization you're in, the scale it's operating at, the context you're operating in.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about like your learnings from your experiments. Like if you do a color change on a CTA and you change the text, maybe you're not able to explain like it was the color change or it was the text. And so like when you're learning to build that, like, you know, for best practices, like, okay, we always see that this type of verbiage on CTAs performs better. So now whenever we push something out, this is the way that it needs to be structured.
Yeah, I sort of like, one of the things I like to push back on are these tests that are just like, let's just try some shit and see what works. Like, you know, like if you're trying to build value for customers, right? Like what's the most valuable thing for the customer? So that, you know, thinking hard about good tests are often really take a long time to design and set up because you have a really strong hypothesis about something that's going to like change the product in a way that makes value for people. If you're just rearranging text and buttons and stuff like that, I think that there's a, you know, John said there's a phase of a company where you do stuff like that. But I don't know. Even at Facebook, I think people wasted their time on that stuff too much. It's like, well, what do customers really want? And can we sit around and think about costly product changes that are going to actually generate that rather than cheap things that we can do in a day or two? You know, in a lot of ways, experimentation, because it can become so cheap that you want to use it to do cheap things. And I think that's a little bit of a pitfall because you can waste a lot of organizational time on stuff that like wasn't really geared toward building value for customers at all.
All right, we are coming up on time here. And people who have been in meetings with me will tell you that I love to end a meeting on time. So let's do like a hot seat, quick final, maybe 1 to 2 sentence takeaway for our audience. Let's go John, Sean, Michelle. So opposite of intros.
Let's see. I think biggest takeaway should be prioritize what's practically significant. Prioritize the hypotheses that are going to be most impactful for your organization, and prioritize getting the data you need and doing the work you need to run experiments to learn about how you can achieve those goals.
I'll do, there's 3, the word experimentation might mean like 3 things reasonably. One is the tool to do measurement, and you should know that, and that should be a tool in your arsenal. 2 is the process of changing your product in a way that you rigorously subject to measurement over time, and you should be good at that and have a good, strong process. And then 3rd is the culture of your organization about how you interpret that stuff and talk about it and make that sort of like the thing that drives the way that you discuss your product or service. And you need to be good at all 3 of those things to succeed. I don't think you can just do one of those 3. I think you need all 3.
Oh gosh, there are just so many potential points of failure in experimentation. I can't like whittle it down, but I guess if I had to say like 3 things, the first would be like start small, do one experiment with 2 variants, make the change dramatic, just so you can kind of like show the value of doing this type of isolating a variable and measuring the impact. The next thing would be like definitely the cultural aspect. There needs to be someone responsible for making sure that the team is working together, that you're thinking through all of the checkpoints, the same way that you like, you know, you could launch Looker and it'll be a total failure if no one's like really responsible for making sure that it's a success, right? The same thing applies to like experimentation programs. And then I guess the last thing I would say is even if an experiment fails, like you still learn something, right? You learn that variable didn't have a big impact and that's still useful. So I guess don't get disheartened by, you know, that average 10% win rate that is pretty much industry standard.
All right, sounds like a great note to end on. Thank you so much to our panelists for spending a little bit of their Thursday with us, and thank you to everyone who attended. We'll get this on YouTube in the next day or so. I'll be sure to share it in the Slack channel. And then just a friendly reminder that just because this panel is over, that doesn't mean we have to stop talking about A/B testing and experimentation. There is an A/B testing channel in Locally Optimistic, and I hope that people can keep the conversation going there. Thanks so much, folks. Happy Thursday.